series in the book of Judges. So that is in the Old Testament, fairly close to the beginning there. So if you start at the beginning of your Bible, turn to the right, you'll get to Judges. So addresses a very important issue that is still prevalent in people's lives today, and it is the issue of drifting. Have you ever felt yourself just drifting in your life? I remember it was last summer. My family, we went to Oak Island, North Carolina, and we rented a house just about a half mile from the beach. And every day we would walk down to the beach. And I remember the first day we got there, we got to the beach, we found like the prime location on the beach and set up the chairs and the towels and all that stuff. And my Beth, my wife, and Hope, my daughter, they sat there on the beach, and me, my son, my son-in-law, we all got in the water and we were having fun, and the waves were, not real severe, but we were having a good time. And then as I was in the water, I looked up just to see what Beth and Hope were doing. And I looked up onto the beach and they were gone. And I was like, what happened? How did they, we hadn't been in the water very long. Where are they? Where could they have gone? And so I started to scan the beach, and I looked about 50 yards to my left. There they were sitting on the beach. They had not moved. I didn't recognize it, and I didn't realize how long it had been, but we just were simply carried by the current further and further down the beach. What I discovered in my life is that sometimes we drift and we don't even realize it. And sometimes we drift and we don't even realize how far or how long we have been drifting. One of my favorite phrases that I say repeatedly, and probably you could quote it by this point, but I say all the time, right? Nothing of value in our lives drifts in the direction we desire. Nothing. You're in the water, you're not going to drift the way you desire. You're in a boat, it's not going to drift the way you desire. You're driving your car down the road, it's not going to drift the way that you desire. Nothing in our lives, even the really important things in our life, financially and relationally, and of course, as I'm talking today, spiritually, nothing drifts in the direction that we desire. And I know this firsthand because in my life, there have been moments and seasons in my life where I have drifted relationally, and I've drifted spiritually, I've drifted financially, and it never ends in the place where I intend it to be. And sometimes we don't even realize how far we have drifted or how long we have drifted. And I think you would understand that as well. You understand that there is nothing in your life that if you just take your hands off of it and just allow it to drift, that it's going to drift where you want. And one day you're going to wake up and you're going to realize and maybe recognize that you drifted further than you expected and further than you intended. That there was a moment in your life when everything just seemed to be perfect. You took your hands off the wheel and then everything turned out to be less than perfect. And that's exactly what we are going to see here in the book of Judges. We're going to see how the people of Israel, that they didn't, and this is true, like we don't wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to drift from God. I'm going to drift away spiritually. We don't do that. Drifting happens oftentimes, and we don't even recognize it. And that's exactly what we're going to discover here in the book of Judges as we start this series entitled Less Than Perfect. The entire book of Judges is about a people of God, the people of God who just drifted. And they drifted and they found themselves in disobedience, which then led to discipline again and again and again throughout the entire book of Judges. And so today, as we begin this series, our memory verse for the series is very important. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 14 and 15. And it tells us this: for the love of Christ controls us, having concluded this, that one died for all, therefore all died. And he died for all, so that they who live might no longer live for themselves, but live for him who died and rose again on their behalf. You see, the thing that keeps us from drifting, the thing that keeps your boat from drifting, is having an anchor. And here, what we're told in 2 Corinthians 5 is that it's the love of Christ that is our anchor. That if we would anchor our lives to the love of Christ and understand the sacrifice that he made on our behalf, and understand that we no longer live for ourselves, but we live for the one who died and rose again on our behalf, that's the anchor that keeps us from drifting. And what we're going to see repeatedly in the book of Judges is that the people of God, they just forgot everything that God had done for them. And it caused them to just simply drift further and further and further away. And so today we are beginning in Judges chapter 2. And today what I want to talk about is the generational drift that we see in the book of Judges. And we understand that there are differences in generations. Ecclesiastes tells us that a generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains. And generation after generation after generation has come and gone on the face of the earth. And you understand this because we sit in a room today and there is multi-generations. And I love that about our church. And the beauty of that is that there is this different kaleidoscope of the generations that are alive. And researchers will tell us that probably currently in the United States of America, there are 6 generations that are alive. And what we understand, right, is there are differences between generations. My generation, the world that I grew up in, was nothing like the world that my parents grew up in. And the world that my grandson is now growing up into is light years away from the world that I grew up in. And we see this change that happens from generation to generation to generation. But it's important for you and I to understand today, as believers, as followers of Jesus Christ, there's one thing that cannot change. And that is our desire and our purpose and our intentionality to hand off the faith to another generation. It's important for us, though the generations may come and go, and there's a divide in our generations and the way we see the world, the most important thing that we need to do is take our faith from one generation and pass it on to another generation, because what we're going to see today in Judges chapter 2, as the people of God drifted away, is that faith is one generation away from extinction. Do you realize that we are just one generation from extinction? This church that we gather together as, this body of Christ, is one generation from extinction. The entirety of our Christian faith is one generation from extinction. That if we do not hand off the faith well, if we do not hand off leadership well to the next generation, we're just simply one generation from extinction. That's exactly what God's people discovered in the book of Judges. And we're going to look at just a few verses today, and we're going to discover how easy this happens, how easy it was for them just to simply drift along and then miss this critical handoff of faith and discover that they went from one generation to the next, and faith became extinct. And so, as I said, this is a series through the book of Judges. I don't know how much you do or do not know about the book of Judges, but the book of Judges is a very dark historical time in the life of the people of Israel. It was a time in which Joshua had died, and we're going to talk about him in a little bit, and it was before Saul became the first king of Israel, and they lived these about 250, maybe 300 years with no central leadership over them. And as a result of that, they just kind of drifted away from the faith. And again, I have a little outline here for the book of Judges if you're wondering how it is constructed. And so the first couple chapters is what we call the prologue. And so it kind of sets the scene. It helps us to understand how we're to read the rest of the book of Judges. And then in chapters 3 through 16 is the deeds of the specific judges. And you probably know some of their names. We got Samson, the guy who was really strong. That's the one everyone remembers. You got a guy who was left-handed that is here in the book of Judges. And you have all of these judges, probably 12. There are 12 major judges in the book of Judges, and it describes what they had done in the life of Israel. Now, when we hear the word judge, we think of a guy sitting in a courtroom behind a big desk wearing a robe. That's not what these guys were. These were not judges in the judicial manner. They were judges, and they were appointed by God. They were raised up by God to be political and military heroes, leaders for the people of Israel, because they kept finding themselves in bondage to their enemies around them. Their enemies would come and they would take them over, and then the people would cry out, and then God would raise up a judge who would set them free from the oppression of their enemies. We're going to see, you read through Judges there, and you see that's what most of the book is about. And then you get to the end, and the last 4 chapters, 17 to 21, is an epilogue, which just simply, there's a few narratives that are given there that kind of helps us to understand what the climate was like during this 300-year period in the life of Israel during the times of the judges. And so we're going to do a couple messages from the very beginning, the prologue, so we kind of set the scene. We're going to look in a couple weeks at the life of Samson, so we can see one of the judges, and then we're going to conclude it in the epilogue so that you kind of get a broad overview of the entire book of Judges. But there is a tremendous instruction for you and I today from the book of Judges. So as I said, we're going to begin in chapter 2, and we're going to see here today, as the scene is set for us in the book of Judges, how faith is one generation from extinction. And so we're going to begin reading in verse number 6 of Judges chapter 2. And the first thing that we see here is the faithful generation. There was a generation that was faithful to God. They served him, they honored him, they worshiped him with their whole heart. We would say today that they were committed followers of God. And so it begins here in verse 6, and it tells us this: when Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land. Now, as I said, this is Judges is this time period between Joshua and Saul. And Joshua, if you're not familiar with who he is, Joshua was the leader who succeeded Moses. We all know Moses. He was one who was in Egypt, and while they were in bondage to the Egyptians, and Moses said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh said, "No." Okay, and so they were there, and then God used Moses, and God brought the plagues on Egypt, and finally Pharaoh let the people go. And it's Moses who leads them to the Red Sea, and God parts the Red Sea. It's Moses who leads them right to the edge of the promised land, and they're about to go in, and he sends spies to check out the land. 12 spies, 10 of them come back and say, "We can't take the land." 2 said, "Absolutely, we can do it." And the 2 who said we could do it were Caleb and Joshua. Moses, however, died without ever stepping foot into the promised land. And upon Moses' death, Joshua became the leader of God's people. And it was Joshua then who led them triumphantly across the Jordan River into the promised land. It's Joshua who led them in conquest of the land. And it's Joshua now who is allowing them, who's leading them into the settlement of the promised land. And here, Joshua, this is a kind of a summary of what had actually happened in Joshua chapter 24. And in Joshua chapter 24, Joshua brought all the people together. And in Joshua chapter 24, you can read about it. Joshua was afraid of the people drifting from God. And so he said to them, he said, "When we come into the land, I want you to remember God. I want you to worship God. I want you to serve God." And it's in Joshua chapter 24 where these famous words are given that maybe some of you have hanging in your house, which says, Joshua said to the people, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Because Joshua knew the tendency of the people, and that was to drift away from God. And so here Joshua gathers them together. He gives them this very last, very important instructions not to drift from God. And then he said, "Now go and dwell in the land." And the tribes of Israel then had inheritance. They had certain plots of land that God had given to them and designated for them to settle in. And so they went and they settled in the land. And this people were faithful to God. And so it goes on in verse 7 and says, "The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel." Now, Joshua would have been a very young man as they were leaving Egypt And so Joshua and some of these other people who would have been elders now would have been young people at the time, and these people would have seen the parting of the Red Sea. They would have actually put their feet on the dry ground and walked across the Red Sea. These would have been people who had tasted the manna that God had provided for them in the wilderness. These would have been people who would have had the mist of the water hitting their face as that water sprung out of the rock. These are the people who would have witnessed God parting the Jordan River as the priests set their feet on the Jordan River and began to enter into the promised land. These would have been people who would have heard the crashing of the walls as Joshua led them in circles around the city of Jericho. It would have been people who had seen God hold the sun in the sky as they were fighting against their enemies. They saw all of this, and they remembered the power and the presence and the provision and the promises of God. And he said, this generation was faithful, and they were faithful to God because they had a personal experience with him. They had seen the mighty deeds that he had done. They had been people who were recipients of the promises that God had made from generation to generation to generation, and they were now the people who were living in the land as fulfillment of those promises. Seen and they experienced all of this. And as a result of that, they served the Lord. But what they didn't maybe realize is that though they were faithful and though they were committed to everything they were committed in all ways to God, maybe they didn't realize that they were just one generation away. That their faith was one generation from extinction. Because what we see next here is an unfaithful generation. Just as there was a generation that was fully devoted and committed to God in their lives, there was another generation that came along that was unfaithful to God. And so I just want to start here and kind of set the scene for why all this that had happened. In verse 8, it tells us, then Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. He lived a long time. And during that time, he led God's people faithfully. In verse 9, it says, and they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. And so here, this is given to us to signal that there is a change that is about to happen. That at this point, the nation of Israel is no longer under the central leadership of one of God's appointed servants. They were under the leadership of Moses. Another generation was under the leadership of Joshua. And now Joshua is dead. He's buried. And there's no leader over the people. There's a very important phrase that is repeated throughout the book of, repeated in the book of Judges that we're going to get to at the end of the series. And it tells us this, that everyone did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king in the land. There was no godly leadership to lead them. And so every man was just kind of doing what was right in their own eyes. And there was just a decentralization of God's people as they were living in the land. And then look at what it tells us here in the very next verse. All that generation were gathered to their fathers. So Joshua and all these elders who had seen God's provision and promises and power in their lives, they've all died. Now the whole generation is gone. And it tells us right after that, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. Now, it doesn't really specifically tell us here if it was the very next generation, But I don't think it really matters. The point is that there was a generation who was faithful, and then it got to a point, to a generation that was unfaithful. And I don't, it says here that they did not know the Lord nor the things that he had done. And I don't think it was the fact that they didn't know about the Red Sea crossing. I don't think it was the fact that they didn't know about how God had provided manna in the wilderness. I don't think it's not that they didn't know how the walls of Jericho fell down miraculously just because God's people marched around the city. I think the way it's written here, it means that it just wasn't precious to them. It wasn't on the forefront of their mind. They had just drifted away. They just simply became stories that generations before them had told. And the reason why I think that is because I've told you multiple times, I grew up on a farm in western Pennsylvania, and I grew up on a farm that has been passed on from generation to generation to generation. And as I was growing up as a young boy, my grandparents lived on a farm that they grew up on. And when I was a young boy, my best friend was probably my grandfather. And every day I would get off the bus, I would walk in the driveway, and the first person, he would always be the first person I would talk to. And I just enjoyed my time with my grandfather as I was a young boy. And I remember in school one day, I learned about this time frame in American history that was called the Great Depression and World War II. And I looked at the dates and I thought, I think my grandfather was old enough to remember that. And so I remember this. I got off the bus, I walked in the driveway, and I went to my grandfather and I asked him, I said, do you remember the Great Depression? And he told me, he was telling me stories about when he was a teenager growing up in the Great Depression and how they had to conserve things and you know, all of the difficulties of living during that time of life. And then he started telling me about the anxiety that he felt as a 20-year-old living during the time of World War II. He told me these stories, and they were so vivid as he told them to me. In the last 40-some years, you know how often I think about the Great Depression and World War II? Very few. It's never really on the forefront of my mind. And I think that's exactly what happened to God's people here. There was a generation who experienced all of these things firsthand, and their faith was vibrant. And a generation or another generation or a generation after that had come along, and they just simply became stories. And generation from generation, they just drifted further and further and further away. And it wasn't that they fought God, they just simply forgot God. And you see, we have an enemy who's satisfied. Not if we stand and we just simply claim that God doesn't exist. He's just satisfied if we just live life forgetting as if God exists. You see, it's amazing how this generational drift can happen. You start with one generation that is committed, sold out. And then you come to another generation that is just complacent. And then that generation gives way to a generation that begins to compromise. And then you end up with a generation that is calloused towards all the things of God. And it didn't happen overnight, but this generational slide, this generational drift just happens so slowly. And in so many ways that we don't even recognize that it's happened. But one day we wake up and we discover that faith is one generation from extinction. So, you have to be asking yourself, right? So because that's true, what should you and I do? Because if you look at the very next verse, in verse number 11, look at the tragedy of what happened here. They slid so far that in verse 11 it tells us, then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. They had forgot God, and then they get to the point at which they are rebelling against God. And the word Baal here is a word, it's a name that the Canaanites gave. It was a word that just means Lord in the Canaanite language. And so understand this, there was a generation that served the Lord, then a generation came up after them who forgot the Lord and began to serve Canaanite lords. And you look up and you look across the beach and you're wondering, how did we get this far away? And it was just a drift that nobody recognized, and they drifted further than they intended, that they thought they would drift. And there we discover that in all of this, that his faith is one generation from extinction. I mean, but how does that apply to you and I today? And so I think this is very important. This is a very convicting passage if you are here and you're a parent or a grandparent, or you hope to be a parent one day. It's a very sobering passage on how easily this generational drift from the faith happens, and in many cases we don't even see it happening right before our eyes. So today, because this is true, what I want to encourage you to do is intentionally pass on the faith. Be intentional. All right, I told you at the beginning, nothing drifts where we want it to go. Your car, your boat, your life, the spiritual lives of your children and your grandchildren are not going to drift where you want it to go. So you and I must be intentional to pass on the faith. I've read some research. This was startling to me, but not surprising. I read this research, and what they discovered is that right now in America, that if you raise children to be Christ followers, you raise them in attending the church and being involved in the activities of the church. When they get up, when they grow up, when they become adults, you know the chances of them remaining in the church, remaining committed to Jesus? It's a coin toss. 50-50 chance. One out of every two kids who, I'm not just talking about all kids, I'm talking about kids who actually grow up in the church. Right now we have a 50-50 chance of them sticking with the faith. Because we live in a culture that is bombarding this upcoming generation with all the other options that seem so much more appealing than the Christian faith. They're being bombarded by entertainment and social media, and they're going off to college with liberal professors, and they're just being bombarded by all of this stuff. And these kids who at one point you would say, man, they look like they're on fire. They look like they're committed to the things of God, but yet half of them are walking the faith. Losing one child is heartbreaking. Losing a whole generation is devastating. So you and I must be intentional. We can't let this drift. This is too important. And so I want to talk, first of all, just the responsibility that you and I have as parents and grandparents. We have a responsibility to our children. But let me ask you, if your children were to look at you and they were to be completely honest, what generation would they see you in? A generation that's committed? A generation that's complacent? A generation that is compromising? What do they see in you? Pastor John and I were talking this week, and we were trying to go back through our many years of ministry combined and trying to figure out, did we ever see a kid grow up in a family that was, a family that was just kind of complacent in their faith, or they were compromising their faith? Did we see a kid grow up in that family who then turned out to be fully committed? And listen, in something like 60 years of combined ministry, We couldn't even think of one. We know of committed kids who have grown up in committed families. We knew of committed kids who grew up in families who had no faith. But there is a generation that's growing up in families that are just complacent and compromising. And their kids are probably going to end up calloused in the faith. The question is not a Christian home. Like, we desire a Christian home, but there's so many who just have a home that Christians live in. And there's a huge difference between the two. And so if your kids were to look at you today, what would they say is most important in your life as parents, as grandparents? Is it the job? Is it the recreation? Is it the money? Is it the promotions? Is it the stuff? Is it the habit? Is it your addiction that they would say, hey, that seems to be most important to mom and dad, if they were honest? Or is it your faith? How you structure your home and how you spend your time. Would your kids say, you know what? In my parents' eyes, it's probably more important for them as to what college I get into or what sport I play or what job I get. And that seems to be more important to them than my spiritual condition, if I walk with God, or even where I spend eternity. What would your children say? Because you got a 50-50 chance right now. Do your kids see you pray? Crying out to God just together as a family. Do your kids see you worshiping God? To see your kids like sacrificing your time in order to serve for the greater cause, for the kingdom of God? Do they see that in you? And I don't want to pick on dads because I'm a dad. But this is so much more important for dads. I don't know what it is, but dads, our words and our lives carry so much weight in the lives of our children. We've discovered this as well, that dads who are fully committed, more likely that the kids are going to stay fully committed. But what would they say about you? You have a responsibility as a parent. Now, I want to stop here, because you can do everything right to the best of your ability and still have a child walk away from the faith. And there's might be some of you here that you're experiencing that. My heart goes out to you. Some of you may be sitting here and you say, Mel, my kids are grown now and I just blew it when I had them. I wish I could do it over. My heart goes out to you. But here's the beauty. God's not done. Continue to pray for your adult children. Continue to pray for the generation that comes after them and the influence and the impact that possibly you could have even on your grandchildren. And don't carry the guilt, because listen, as your children grow older, they become accountable to God on their own. You need to understand that. And so this is not, I don't want this to be a guilt trip. What I am trying to say is like, you and I need to be intentional as we pass on the faith, as parents, as grandparents. But on the other side of that, corporately, maybe you're here, you don't have kids, you don't want kids, you don't ever plan on having kids. Listen, corporately as a church, all of us have a responsibility to pass on the faith to the next generation. One of our core values here at Hillside is children's ministry. We plant now so that we can harvest later. There are so many avenues in which you can be involved in helping to plant the seed in that next generation to see it harvested later in life. That's why during our second services, we do children's church, so the kids can hear the gospel in their own language and be able to make it more relatable to them. That's why every summer we do Vacation Bible School, because we have kids that will come here, and some of them, this may be the first and only time that they hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's why we do children's programming on Wednesday nights, so the kids can be in a small group with an adult leader who can help them navigate and to answer questions and to really help form a worldview in their lives. That's why we do youth group, so that our teenagers can be influenced with the message of the gospel. And we're planting these seeds now so that we can harvest later. Like, listen to this. How much joy do you think it would be for you to spend some time on a Wednesday night as a small group leader for third grade boys? And then 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, be able to sit here and witness them being baptized into the faith. That's what it's all about. To see people, kids that may have been in the youth group that you helped with, and to see them committing their lives and going off into ministry. We plant now so that we can harvest later. So we have a responsibility as individual parents, but we have a responsibility corporately as the church to pass on the faith, be intentional to pass it on. This is way too important to just let it drift. Because faith is one generation from extinction. And it happens faster than we could even imagine. So I want to encourage you to be intentional. Now the question here remains, like, what happened in Judges? Did they not hand off the baton, or did the baton not get received? Like what happened there? And I would say both likely happened, because both still happen today. Like, we can hand off the baton, but the baton may not be received by the next generation. But the next generation is never going to receive it unless we actually hand it off. So it's important for us to get the hand off right. When I was a track coach, I had a relay team. It was the 4x400 relay team. And going into the state meet, we were ranked third in the entire state. I had a really good team. And so the race started, the first 3 runners, they ran around the track, and it was us and another team that was vying for first place. And we still had our fastest kid to run. And so I was excited. I was anticipating us winning the state meet and becoming 4x400 meter champions. And on the last handoff, I'm not exactly sure today what happened, but the baton got dropped on the track. We ended up finishing the race 5th. Not because we didn't have the fastest kids. It was all in the handoff. We can do everything right to the glory of God, but if we don't get the handoff right, why does it matter? Faith is one generation from extinction. So be intentional to pass on faith. Father, we thank you today. I think most importantly that even when we drift in unfaithfulness, that you remain faithful. And I know that there are some in this room here this morning, and they're heartbroken over a generation that is coming after them. God, I pray that all of us would rely on your faithfulness in this, but also that we would take our responsibility seriously. And so I pray for young parents, that as they start down this journey of parenthood, that they would be intentional. I pray for those of us on the other end, and maybe now we're welcoming grandchildren into the world. I pray that we would still see our role in the critical role we have in order to hand off the faith to that next generation. And so I pray that you would use us, that we would remain faithful to you, that we would not allow ourselves to drift, and that we would take this moment, this critical moment that we have, and do it all for the glory of Christ. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.